Well, thanks so much, John, and I'll second what has been said about Larry. This is such a terrific program and a terrific series of events, and it's something that the Hauenstein Center is going to continue to learn from in the future. I appreciate so much you're all coming out tonight. If there's one night a year where you're allowed to have Founders Fatigue, it's July 5th. So glad to have you all here. Appreciate very much your commitment. And I will say, we saw the town crier that John mentioned, and I've never had such a reception anywhere. I was out to dinner with Glebes Whitney and Adam Bradway, both on staff at the Hauenstein Center. And we came out only to see the crier with his bell talking about the Hauenstein Center and tonight's event. So it was a fantastic addition, and we appreciated it very much. So without further ado, I'm going to keep on top of your Founders Fatigue and see if I can keep your attention here. John Adams made a prediction 235 years ago this week about the Day of Independence. Quote, "It will be the most memorable event in the history of America. I am apt to believe that it will be celebrated by succeeding generations as the great anniversary festival. It ought to be solemnized with pomp and parade, with shows, games, sports, bells, bonfires, and illuminations, from one end of this continent to the other, from this time forward, forevermore." Now, that statement is notable today for two reasons. First of all, Adams was predicting illuminations across the continent at a time when the newborn United States ended at the Alleghenies. Second, he was predicting a July 2nd Independence Day, one that would have lionized Adams's role as the Atlas of Independence rather than Jefferson's role as its Prometheus. His ambition and vanity are well known, but his miscalculation would prove prophetic. Adams and Jefferson, as you know, died on July 4th, 1826, separated by 5 hours and 500 miles, exactly 50 years after the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson still survives Adams uttered shortly before his death at 6 in the evening. He's, of course, wrong. Jefferson had died about 5 hours earlier. His story began in the same place it ended. Adams came of age in the city of legends, modern-day Quincy, Massachusetts, surrounded by granite outcroppings that would become the bedrock of that town's economy. Quincy granite from the Quincy Quarry reached a national market by 1826 via the Granite Railway. Today you can visit the Adams family tomb at the United First Parish Church. Both tomb and church are made of granite. From birth to death, like the rock that so abounds in his town, Adams was defined by his toughness, even his coarseness. He scrapped, and he made himself a giant of the age. But the man of granite lived modestly. His hands, writes biographer David McCullough, were the hands of a man accustomed to pruning his own trees, cutting his own hay, and splitting his own wood. He had little inheritance, he was never rich, and he never enjoyed great social standing. He amassed no great fortune in his lifetime. And yet John Adams, as you'll see, was an incredibly fortunate man. Yes, he had sadness in his private life. During the 2 decades of his ascent from Boston lawyer to vice president of the United States, Adams spent a full 10 of 20 years apart from his best and beloved friend, Abigail. In the end, he outlived her and 4 of their 6 children. Susanna died before her 2nd birthday in 1770. Elizabeth was stillborn in 1777. Charles died of alcoholism at the age of 30 in 1800. Nabby, his eldest, of cancer, breast cancer, in 1813. Asked if he would like to live his life again, Adams responded, "I've had a father and lost him. I've had a mother and lost her. I have had a wife and lost her. I have had children and lost them. I have had honorable and worthy friends. and I've lost them. And instead of suffering these griefs again, I had rather go forward and meet my destiny. Yes, he was destined to be overshadowed by others of the Founding Fathers, wedged, as his lonely term was, between 16 years of Jefferson and Washington and Jefferson. The history of our revolution, Adams wrote to his good friend Benjamin Rush, will be one of continued lie from one end to the other. The essence of the whole will be that Dr. Franklin's electrical rod smote the earth and outsprung George Washington. That Franklin electrified him with his rod, and thenceforward the two conducted all policy, negotiations, legislatures, and war. Yes, he was president too late to avoid Washington's long shadow, and too early to make the legacy-clenching Louisiana Purchase. His presidency began at an inopportune moment, with political animosities at home and troubles abroad. Jefferson's electoral runner-up in 1796 appreciated the difficulties his opponent faced. The president, Jefferson wrote, speaking of Washington, is fortunate to get off the bubble just as it's bursting, leaving others to hold the bag. Yet as his departure will mark the moment when the difficulties begin to work, you will see that they will be ascribed to the new administration. No man will carry out of that office the legacy that brought him into it. Jefferson knew it. Despite all of this, Adams's career was charmed in one big way. One big way. He lived in a time and place where his enormous talents could work for a noble and enduring cause, one much larger than he ever could have imagined. You see, as a youth, Adams faced the same questions our students do today. Who am I? What is my purpose? What will I do with my life? I will never shine, Adams wrote in his diary, till some animating occasion calls forth all my powers. Well, the occasion came, as you know, and shine he did. At the Second Continental Congress, he led the charge for independence against rivals John Dickinson, Edward Rutledge, and others. He orated, debated, jockeyed behind the scenes in advance of the July 2nd vote. It was Adams who pressed to adopt the Continental Army. Adams who selected Washington to lead that army. Adams who handpicked Jefferson to write the Declaration of Independence. He served on 90 committees. 90 committees. And he headed the Board of War and Ordnance, which, according to biographer Joseph Ellis, essentially made him a one-man War Department responsible for raising, equipping, and assuring civilian control over the entire American military. One man. He rose above a Congress of giants, a school of political prophets, as Adams called it. According to a fellow delegate, it was the opinion of every man in the House, every man, that Adams possessed the clearest head and firmest heart of any man in that Congress. The fire at his igneous core overflowed and underlaid that American cause. This man of granite revealed an unexpected luster. He had the good fortune of being born in a time and place where he could shine, where his values and temperament aligned with the nation's needs, if not always its political moods. He was lucky to reach the peak of his powers at the right moment, and as we shall see, Adams's reputation and the revolution erupted onto the world simultaneously. Now, Seneca the Younger has been quoted saying that luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity. Yet, as we shall see, even in preparation, Adams benefited enormously from 3 strokes of good luck. And we'll take you through those and then let you guys get back out into that heat. The first is in his lineage. Adams was incredibly fortunate to have his lineage. The first stout-hearted Atlas was descended from the mythic Titan of seas, lakes, rivers, and oceans, and he summoned the power of his forefathers to hold the heavens high. Our Atlas of Independence, John Adams, was descended from the great Puritan migration to the Massachusetts Bay Colony. His forefathers were the source of his most deeply held values, which would, time and again, be Adams's saving grace and the nation's. At the end of his life, Adams, unlike many of his contemporaries, chose not to write his own epitaph, lionizing his own accomplishments. Instead, he placed a stone at the first Henry Adams's grave, evoking the virtues that all of us could aspire to. I quote, "This stone and several others have been placed in this yard by a great-great-grandson from a veneration of the piety, humility, simplicity, prudence, frugality, industry, and perseverance of his ancestors, in hopes of recommending an affirmation of their virtues to their posterity." His decision is telling. These noble virtues were Adams's finest inheritance, greatest ambition, and the most important legacy, as he saw it, to his children. By all accounts, Adams himself was a notably honest man, independent and hard-working, even if he was obliged to confront his vanity, jealousy, and occasional intemperance. His virtues were rooted in a lineage that arrived in the New World by 1638. Edith Squire and the first Henry Adams imparted them to their 9 children and 89 grandchildren. 89 grandchildren. Adams was proud of his descent from this line of virtuous New England farmers. They were a people who earned their daily bread by the work of their hands, writes biographer David McCullough. The men were all farmers who, through the winters in New England fashion, worked other trades for hard money. The first John Adams, for example, was a farmer and shoemaker, a man of sturdy, unostentatious demeanor who, like his father, played the role of solid citizen as a tithing man, constable, lieutenant in the militia, selectman, and ultimately church deacon. Adams admired his father's superior wisdom, benevolence, and charity. He channeled these qualities, and with Abigail, nurtured them in his children. "Let frugality and industry be our virtues," he wrote Abigail in a letter about their children. "Fire them with an ambition to be useful." Now, lest we gain an all too pious image of John Adams, we should recall this is the same man who called Alexander Hamilton the bastard brat of a Scotch peddler. Thomas Paine, a mongrel between pig and puppy, begotten of a wild boar on a bitch wolf. And Paine's common sense, a poor, ignorant, malicious, short-sighted, crapulous mass. Adams's venom tongue may well have been what kept him from the ministry, which was a calling he considered through his childhood, his young adulthood, and forward. For Adams, it would have been, in biographer Joseph Ellis's words, in its clearest and most pure form, a commitment to the virtuous life. Now, he chose law over church, but not vice over virtue. Adams wrote, quote, "I set out with firm resolutions never to commit any meanness or injustice in the practice of law." His profession did not, quote, "dissolve the obligations of morality and religion," end quote. Now, Ellis writes that Adams carried with him into a secular calling of lawyer and later public officialdom the moral obligations and self-imposed expectations of that New England ministry, even though he chose not to be a minister. His impossibly high standard for virtue, disinterestedness, and purity seemed to require isolation and unpopularity as evidence of their authenticity. Thus we arrive at Adams's most fortunate inheritance from his forefathers, a fierce independence. A fierce independence. He had a dark, if well-informed, view of human nature unleashed. "We may appeal to every page of history we have hitherto turned over," Adams wrote, "for proofs irrefragable that the people, when they have been unchecked, have been unjust, tyrannical, brutal, barbarous, and cruel, as any king or senate possessed of uncontrollable power." Adams stood by what he judged virtuous, and correct, not what he judged popular. He was suspicious of popularity, and he often equated popular measures with corrupt motives. And this would be the blessing and curse of his whole political career. The decisive example cost him his prospects for a second presidential term. Much of Adams's presidency, you see, was ailed by war fever. During the quasi-war with France, French privateers assaulted U.S. shipping, killing 20 Americans, wounding 40, and diverting more than 300 American ships and their cargoes. The economic impact of this war was crippling. It was an undeclared war sliding toward the official transatlantic conflagration that Washington had warned against in his farewell address. The Union was too young. Its resources were too meager. Its military might too nebulous. The outcome, Adams knew, would be disastrous. When news reached American shores of the XYZ affair, French Minister Talleyrand's demand for bribes, in essence, in exchange for negotiations, cries for an American declaration of war grew deafening. As a wartime president, Adams experienced something very interesting. He became very, very popular for the first time in his life. The song Adams and Liberty became a national anthem. Characteristically, Adams grew suspicious. Remember that minister in him. Adams grew suspicious. And at the height of the war's popularity, he sent a new and very highly unpopular peace mission to France. He consulted no one. Opponents inside and outside of his party all described themselves as thunderstruck, absolutely thunderstruck. Nobody saw this coming. Nobody would expect a president to throw his popularity away in such a fashion. Ellis writes, Adams consulted not a single member of his cabinet or party, made no effort to prepare or persuade the political leadership in Congress, and most incredibly, proceeded to absent himself from the seat of government for the next 7 months, remaining ensconced at Quincy, reading the collected works of Frederick the Great. Political turmoil. He's reading Frederick the Great. Now, as we know, the peace mission succeeded in preventing the escalation of a disastrous war. The Convention of 1800 ended hostilities. The United States was set on a path toward the Louisiana Purchase and an eventual coast-to-coast continental empire. The nation was primed for its greatest demographic and economic boom, one of its greatest in history. Alienated, isolated, stout-hearted Adams lost his presidency. So he's fortunate in his lineage. It's what gave him his vehement independence. Now what I'd like to talk about is his fortune, his good fortune in learning, because this also was so immense, such an immense contributor to his later success. Let me grab my water first. Now John Adams, as you all know, was perhaps the most brilliant mind of the American founding generation. His good friend and fellow Congressman, Benjamin Rush, in fact, claimed that Adams possessed more learning, probably, both ancient and modern, than any man who subscribed the Declaration of Independence. He saw, quote, the whole subject at a glance, end quote. He was an incessant reader, writes David McCullough. He read Cicero, Tacitus, and other Roman heroes in Latin, and Plato, Thucydides, in the original Greek, which he considered the supreme language. But in his need to fathom the labyrinth of human nature, as he said, he was drawn to Shakespeare and Swift, and likely carried a copy of Cervantes, or a volume of English poetry with him on his journeys. Adams's oft-quoted lesson to his son Johnny, "You will never be alone with a poet in your pocket," was one he learned over a lifetime of experience. If Rush, Jefferson, Theodore Parker, and others of his era remembered Adams as a peerless intellect and with peerless learning, it was not always so. Tell me if you've heard this one. He who never learns his ABC forever will a blockhead be. Thus goes a line from Adams's first textbook, the New England Primer. He got his earliest education at home, but got no joy from it. None. Adams had no ambition to further his education or to go to college, wishing only to become a farmer. He continued his education, however, at Braintree's Latin School, reading and reciting Latin ad nauseum, learning grammar, discovering a few classics, dabbling in rhetoric, logic, arithmetic. All along the way, Adams slacked, daydreamed, underperformed, and grew more and more impatient. Finally, one day, he told his father he was prepared to quit school altogether and become a farmer. Now, imagine your child coming to you and telling you this. A farmer, his father exclaimed. I'll show you what it takes to be a farmer. Early the following morning, biographer John Furling writes, father and son descended into marsh in pursuit of thatch. All day, under a hot sun, the two struggled through knee-deep mud, stooping and cutting and lifting, and finally tying together bundles of thatching. Only when the sun began to set and the black water numbed their feet did his father relent and call an end to the day's work. Bone tired, John trudged home. He returned to school. He returned to school, as all of us would. This time with a new teacher named Joseph March, who finally engaged Adams's mind. This is where he met his lifelong companion Cicero, who carried with him to the presidency. Later, when he was preparing to go to college at age 15, back then, he rode to Harvard alone on his father's mare to take the examination of candidates for admissions before the college's president and masters. He's a 15-year-old. He was sufficiently terrified, later recalling dark and threatening clouds all along his path, a treacherous and foreboding ride. He was, to his great relief, declared fitted for college, and then his father did a remarkable thing. This father who had prodded him for so long in his education. McCullough writes, it had long been an article of faith in the Adamses family that land was the only sound investment, and once purchased, was never, ever to be sold. Only once is Deacon John known to have broken this self-imposed rule, and that was when he sold 10 acres to help send his son to Harvard. Adams went to Harvard and discovered there enchanted scenes. Her name was Hannah Quincy, and John was inspired to propose to her on one memorable evening. The only problem was that his friends didn't know the plan, and several of them came stumbling into the room, interrupting his proposal, unaware of what was transpiring. Now, the proposal never came. The moment passed. The accident, Adams wrote in his diary, left me at liberty and delivered me from my dangerous shackles. Now, the happy accident. You would have been, what was that?
You said it was 58.
No. Yeah, 1758. Yep. 23. Now, this happy accident lengthened his education. Now let me collect my thoughts, he wrote, and apply them with steady resolution and an aspiring spirit to the prosecution of my studies. It refocused him on his burgeoning career. Let love and vanity be extinguished, and the great passions of ambition, patriotism, break out. Most importantly, it left room for a happier distraction to arrive in 1759. Abigail Smith would be the most important tutor of his life. So I'd like to conclude our time together considering Adams's great luck and love, having missed out that first time, fortunately. Now, John and Abigail Adams met in the summer of 1759. This would have helped with the math. John was 24 years old. Abigail was 15. They put off marriage for the sake of John's studies, but through 5 years of courtship, their eagerness increased. John wrote in his diary, "The temper and habits of stale virginity are growing upon her. She is a constant feast, tender, feeling, sensible, friendly, a friend, not an imprudent, not an indelicate, not a disagreeable word or action, prudent, soft, sensible, obliging, active." This is how Adams described her early on. She would become his Portia, the long-suffering Roman wife of Brutus, portrayed as Shakespeare as her husband's most courageous advisor and confidant. Abigail herself admired Portia's strength during Brutus's years abroad, so much so that she later adopted the heroine's name as a pseudonym for her letters to John. John, for his part, addressed Abigail as his dearest friend, his best, dearest, worthiest, wisest friend in the world. That indeed she was, and more. His friend, his partner, his advisor, his compass, his bedrock. They married on October 25th, 1764, in a service officiated by her father, and they began a tremendously consequential life together. Biographer David McCullough writes, "For Adams, life had been made infinitely fuller. All the ties he felt to the old farm were stronger now with Abigail in partnership. She was the ballast he had wanted, the vital center of a new and better life." Abigail was beautiful. Artist Gilbert Stuart completed a portrait of Abigail in 1801 and commented on her beauty. He said he wished he could have painted her when she was younger. I should have had a perfect Venus," he said. Which is a backhanded compliment if I've ever heard one, when she was younger. Abigail was brilliant, every bit her husband's equal. Universally, her contemporaries comment on her intelligence, her wit, and her strong point of view in all things. All things. Abigail was wise. She wrote to her son, John Quincy, these somewhat famous words, "These are the times in which a genius would wish to live. It is not in the still calm of life or in the repose of Pacific Station that great characters are formed. The habits of a vigorous mind are formed in contending with difficulties. Great necessities call out great virtues." She had good humor. To John's catalog, get this, to his catalog of her faults, imperfections, and defects, in which he criticized her lackluster card-playing abilities, her bashfulness, her poor singing voice and posture, her incessant leg crossing, which ruins the figure in the air, and her parrot-toed stride, she responded only mildly. "Lysander must excuse me," she wrote, "if I still persist in some of them, at least until I'm convinced that an alteration would contribute to his happiness. You know, I think that a gentleman has no business to concern himself with the legs of a lady." She was a hard worker, rising at 5 in the morning and working often from dawn until dusk. She did everything that needed doing, McCullough writes. All her life she would do her own sewing, baking, feed her own ducks and chickens, churn her own butter. She was ambitious for her husband. She wrote to John, "You cannot be, I know, nor do I wish to see you, an inactive spectator. We have too many high-sounding words and too few actions that correspond with them." In Boston, Abigail endured deadly epidemics and the dangers of war, alone with her children, while John was in Philadelphia. She even witnessed the Battle of Bunker Hill. She wrote to John, "The constant roar of cannon is so distressing that we cannot eat, drink, or sleep." At home, Abigail did virtually all of the parenting, while John was abroad for the better part of a decade in Philadelphia and Europe. She dealt with the illnesses, the growing pains, the small rebellions, and the need for discipline. As an example, Abigail wrote to her increasingly snobbish son, John Quincy, who was getting a reputation for being a little full of himself. She wrote this. Tell me if your parents ever said anything like this to you. If you are conscious that you possess more knowledge upon some subject than others of your standing, reflect that you have had greater opportunities of seeing the world and obtaining a knowledge of mankind than any of your contemporaries. That you have never wanted a book that has not been supplied to you, that your whole time has been spent in the company of men, of literature and science. How unpardonable it would have been in you to have become a blockhead. Yet in all their years of trial and separation, John and Abigail never lost their flame. I have traveled with you over the wide Atlantic, Abigail wrote to John during his treacherous voyage to France in their 14th year of marriage, and I could have landed you safe and humble confidence at your desired haven. She was there with him, even when she was actually home. If I were near, John wrote to Abigail during his 61st year of life, I would soon convince you I'm not a year above 40. Now, Abigail Adams died in October 1818, 1 month shy of her 74th birthday. Do not grieve, my friend, my dearest friend, Abigail wrote to her husband shortly before her death. I am ready to go, and John, it will not be long. It would turn out to be 8 years before John died on July 4th at the age of 90. The Atlas of Independence, the man of granite, lived a long and fruitful life, and a fortunate one. He came of age in an age of revolution, one that by accidents of time and place found John Adams at its center. Without tremendous good luck in lineage, learning, and love, he could not possibly have summoned the powers necessary to rise to the challenge. But rise he did, and how fortunate for the rest of us. Thank you.